Let us discuss Spring transactional annotation in our Spring application. How to use it. Transactional annotation describes the transaction attributes on an individual method or in class. This annotation belongs to ORG framework transaction annotation package. When we use transactional annotation at class level, it applies as a default to all methods of the declaring class and its subclasses. To enable transactional annotation, we need to use enable transaction management annotation in conjunction with configuration, and we can also enable this annotation transaction annotation using TX annotation-driven namespace if we are using XML configuration. So if we are using Java config, then use enable transaction management with configuration, and if we are using XML configuration and we want to use transaction annotation, in that case we need to use this namespace TX annotation-driven. So in our application, to use transactional annotation, we need to follow these steps. First of all, use enable transaction management with configuration, and the second is we need to create a transaction manager. Here I am using Hibernate, so I will create a transaction manager for Hibernate transaction manager. Hibernate transaction manager is a platform transaction manager implementation for a single Hibernate session factory. It binds a Hibernate session from the specified factory to a thread, potentially allowing for one thread bound session per factory. So this is our bin. Just create the object of Hibernate transaction manager, passing the session factory. Okay. Now we are ready to use transactional annotation. As we know that we can use at method level as well as class level. Okay. So we need to understand its attributes, how it affects our transaction. First of all, isolation. It represents transaction isolation level. This is an attribute, and to use isolation attribute, we need to use in this way. Isolation is equal to the values from isolation enum. Let us see what are the isolation values from the Spring doc. Read committed, read uncommitted, repeatable read, serializable. These are the isolations. Like read committed. What is this? Dirty reads are prevented, non-repeatable reads and phantom reads can occur. And if we use read uncommitted, then dirty reads, non-repeatable reads and phantom reads, all the three can occur. Repeatable read, dirty reads and non-repeatable reads are prevented and phantom reads can occur. Serializable, dirty reads, non-repeatable reads and phantom reads are prevented. So we can use any of these, and if we use default, then this is the underlying data source, whatever is using out of these four will be applied. Okay. So to use isolation, we need to use isolation attribute and pass here. This was the isolation. Second attribute is label. Just define the description. What does this do? We can use here. No rollback for. This is the attribute. The throwable array type we can assign here Exception classes, it accepts exception classes for which there must not be a transaction rollback. By default, what happens that if it gets any exception, then the transaction will be rollback. But we can assign some exceptions if you want, that for these exceptions, if they occur, no need to roll back. Next, no rollback for class name. The string array type, it accepts exception class names for which there must not be a transaction rollback. Here we can assign, the difference is just we can assign the class name as an string, okay, and no difference with this, no rollback for and no rollback for class name. Both works the same thing. The difference is we assign the class, and here we assign the class name as an string. Now let us see what is propagation. To specify propagation, we need to use propagation attribute. The propagation enum type is there, we will discuss it here. We can assign the values of propagation in this way. Use propagation attribute and then get the value from its enum. Let's see more about it from the Spring Duck. Propagation can be mandatory, nested, never, not supported, required, requires new, supports. Let's see what are these. Mandatory. Support a current transaction through an exception if none exists. Nested. Execute within a nested transaction if a current transaction exists. Never. Execute non-transactionally and throw an exception if transaction exists. Not supported. Execute non-transactionally, suspend the current transaction if one exists. Required. Support a current transaction, create a new one if none exists. Requires new. Create a new transaction and suspend the current transaction if one exists. Supports. Support a current transaction, execute non-transactionally if none exists. So these are the propagation enum, and we can use using propagation attribute. Okay. Now let us see read only attribute. If the value is true, read only value is equal to true, it indicates that the transaction is read only. It means the methods in which we only get the data we can use for those operations. Rollback for the throwable array type, specify, we have already done it. Timeout, the integer type, this is the timeout for the transaction in seconds. If any method taking longer time, we can specify the timeout, and if the timeout, then transaction cancels. Timeout as a string, we can also pass the timeout as a string using timeout string attribute. Transaction manager, specify the transaction manager. In our case, I have created the Hibernate transaction manager as a bean, so I will use this will be the bean name here, or you can specify bean name here. By default, this is the bean name. So specify here bean name, transaction manager. Here my transaction manager is Hibernate transaction manager. Okay. So this was about the transaction annotation. Let's see about the example. Let's see how we will implement in our application. I have already told you that use first enable transaction management with Java config. Here I have a Java config as db config, and I have used like this @enable transaction management. And we have also to create a transaction manager. I have created here transaction manager. Okay. Now let us see how to use transactional annotation in our DAO classes. This is our repository, and use transactional annotation. Here I am using I'm using at the class level. So propagation is propagation that requires new, and isolation is isolation that read committed. So these two things will be applied to all its methods of this class. And if you want to change, we can override at the method level. Suppose here I am using at the transactional for the update person, and here I am changing the isolation. Okay, we can also change the default value of the transactional. The default value of the transactional for read only attribute is false. We can change it here. Okay, in this way we can use at the transitional annotation in our Spring application. Let's run it. It's working. Okay. Okay, thank you.